Chapter 42, William Post. For reasons that no one at Leavenworth quite understood, inmates rarely had trouble finding women willing to correspond or visit them. Surprisingly often, these relationships led to marriage. The third Thursday of each month was reserved for weddings in the prison visiting room, and there were at least 2 every month, sometimes more. Many of the brides had never known their husbands outside prison. Some of them married inmates who had no chance of parole. Because the Bureau did not permit conjugal visits, many of the marriages were never consummated. But it didn't matter. Every morning, just before 8 o'clock, a steady stream of women, often dressed in their Sunday best and with children in tow, congregated outside the prison entrance waiting to visit inmates. William Post had gotten married while in prison, and he still wore his wedding ring, although the marriage had been dissolved. He met his bride in 1979, 6 years after he went to prison in Marion for bank robbery and learned that Glenda Thomas had died from a drug overdose. By that time, Post had managed to move from Marion to the state prison in Folsom, California, where he was serving time for bank robbery of the all-night market at his shootout with Glendale police. Post had been corresponding with his niece while at Folsom, and in August, she convinced her best friend Priscilla Kane to go with her to visit Uncle Bill. Kane was 25, had been married 11 years, and lived in Stockton with her husband and 2 small children, Carrie and Kimberly. For the moment she met Post, she was intrigued. He looked much different from the way he was to appear years later in Leavenworth. While in Folsom, Post was meticulous about his appearance. He could have cut bread with the creases in his pants, Kane recalled. He even ironed his t-shirts. The 2 women had to visit Post via a telephone booth, in which inmates were separated from visitors by a plexiglass window. When Kane asked Post why he was not permitted to meet visitors in person, like other convicts, he explained that he was being punished because a woman had been caught smuggling him a handcuff key a few days before. When she returned to her home, Kane began receiving daily letters from Post. Her husband thought it was funny that she was corresponding with a bank robber, but Kane soon found herself sharing the most intimate details of her life with her new pen pal. A man in prison can focus completely on you, and Bill did just that, Kane recalled. I used to get long, beautiful letters. I'd never met a man I could talk to on such a high intellectual level. He challenged my mind. It used to take me an hour just to look up the words in the dictionary that I wanted to use to answer his letters. Years later, Kane would look back upon those days when she first met Post and described herself as perfect prey. She had a miserable childhood. Her father had sexually abused her older sister and then had abandoned the family when the police were notified. Kane's sister developed anorexia and died. Kane married at age 15 to escape from home, only to have her marriage turn sour. She and her husband still lived together but slept in separate rooms. Shortly after Kane met Post, doctors discovered that she had cancer of the uterus and performed a hysterectomy. Bill had flowers sent to me and called me on the phone every day I was in the hospital, she recalled. He always had time to listen to me, and he told me exactly what I wanted and needed to hear. He said I was beautiful, that I was still sexy and desirable after the operation. He told me I was extremely important to him. In 1980, Kane divorced her husband. She was in love with Post. Twice each week, she and her children drove to Folsom to be with him. A guard took her aside one afternoon. You're not like most women who come here, he said. You got a nice family, well-mannered kids. Do yourself a favor and stay away from Post. The advice irritated Kane. Bill was so gentle and loving, especially with my children, she recalled. They adored him. They loved him as much as their real father, and he really was helping me discover who I was and gain self-confidence. I was sure he was different from other inmates. One day while Kane was waiting for Post to be brought into the visiting room, she overheard a guard talking to a woman. Today's not your day to visit inmate Post, the guard said, turning the woman away. As soon as Post came into the visiting room, Kane described what she had heard and Post confessed. The visitor was Cynthia Post. He had known her for more than 1 year. They had met each other through an advertisement in a white supremacy magazine, he said. The woman had fallen in love with him, quit her job, sold her home in Tennessee, moved to California to be near him, and changed her last name to his. She had been visiting Post on the days that Kane and her children stayed at home. He told me it was over between them, she recalled, and that he loved me and my children. I was so head over heels in love, I just accepted that. Cynthia Post confronted Kane and her children when they came out of prison that same day. I want you to know you are getting into more than you think, Cynthia Post said. You don't know what you're talking about, Kane replied, expecting an angry exchange. Instead, Cynthia Post burst into tears, and Kane felt so sorry for her that she embraced her. You don't know what you are getting into, Cynthia Post repeated. He'll use you and then just throw you away. Kane refused to think the worst of Post. I really believe that Bill loved me, really, and truly loved me. So I just ignored everything that would normally make a person suspicious, she said. I finally had found someone who loved me for who I was, who accepted me and encouraged me. Kane was thrilled when Post asked her to marry him. But when she told Post's niece, who had introduced them, the woman was outraged. She came to see me at my house carrying a stack of letters from Bill, Kane said. He had been courting her too. Kane drove to Folsom and demanded an explanation, but Post was again persuasive enough to convince her that he loved her and only her, and on February 5, 1982, they were married at Folsom Prison. Post had told Kane that the parole board considered married convicts a much better parole risk than those without families, and Kane quickly became a relentless advocate for her husband. 6 years later, officials at Folsom would still remember Priscilla Kane Post as the woman who drove us all nuts about getting her husband a parole. Post was paroled from the state prison a short time later, but was immediately turned over to the Bureau to finish his sentence for bank robbery and was transferred to Leavenworth. Kane wanted to follow him, but she became ill, was bedridden for several months, lost her job, and spent what savings she had. Despite those problems, Kane felt confident that she would be able to rebuild her life with her husband after the Federal Parole Commission considered his appeal in June 1983. She was sure that Post would be paroled. Kane had spent months preparing for the June parole meeting. She had found 2 employers who promised to hire Post if he were released. She had solicited dozens of letters of recommendations for him. She had even cajoled her ex-husband into writing a favorable letter in Post's defense. Despite her illness, Kane continued to make calls to various public officials on Post's behalf. The most touching pleas presented to the Parole Commission, however, came from Kane herself and her 2 children, particularly her daughter, Kimberly. Written in large scroll of a 7-year-old, Kimberly's letter to the commission said, I need my daddy. I love my daddy. I know he has done wrong, but he has been good now. I beg you to let him come home so he can hold me in his arms without having to always leave me alone. He cries when I leave, and I cry too. I love him. Priscilla Kane's 4-page handwritten note was equally poignant. I don't trust easily, especially where my life or the other lives of my children are concerned. But after knowing Bill for over 3 years and being his wife for over 16 months, I have found that no one could be a better husband or father than Bill. He has never had a family of his own before. It does make a difference. Our children need him. I need him too. Kimberly has brought his picture to the table at mealtime many times and announced, Daddy is having dinner at home tonight. This baby has vowed not to cut her hair until her daddy is home. Her hair is well below her waist now. Please let Bill go. It was during this period that Post had attempted various therapy groups, gotten his college degree, and won the accolades of the teachers who taught in prison. He had kept out of trouble too. In short, he seemed to be the perfect candidate for parole. I was so convinced that he was going to be released that I didn't even consider what would happen if the commission said no, Kane said. It did. Kane and Post were dumbstruck. We had worked so hard and it seemed so unfair. There just didn't seem like there was any reason for him not to be set free, said Kane. I was furious and my children were crushed. Kane wanted to visit him, but she couldn't afford the trip. A friend telephoned Prison Fellowship Ministries, the national organization founded by former White House Special Counsel Charles W. Colson, who had served time in prison for his role in the Watergate scandal. Colson's organization paid to send Kane and her children to Leavenworth. It was a miracle, Kane recalled, a true miracle. The first day of the visit was wonderful. I was so happy to be with them. But the second day turned ugly. Post began arguing with Kane's children, at one point threatening to spank Kimberly. He no longer had any patience with them. Even more disturbing to Kane was the fact that Post asked her to help him escape. He asked me to bring him a handcuff key, she said. I couldn't believe it. I told him, look, I'm not a gun moll. You had that with Glenda Thomas, but I'm no Bonnie and Clyde. I love you. I will stick with you, but I'm not going to do anything illegal. Kane thought Post would be happy when she told him on the third and final day of their visit that she had found an apartment in Leavenworth and was planning to move to Kansas. But he suddenly became cold, and when she returned to Stockton, he telephoned her. I want to put the marriage on hold, he said. During the next few weeks, Kane received a number of strange telephone calls from him. I'm not a prude, but he wanted me to do things that I wouldn't do, sexual things over the phone that I wouldn't do. He also sent her letters that included the numbers of stolen credit cards and asked her to use them to buy things for him. I didn't know what was happening. It was like this was a different man from the one I married and loved. Overnight, Post stopped writing and calling. Her letters went unanswered. Even her children couldn't get Post to reply. A few months later, Kane received a copy of divorce papers from Post in the mail. We always had promised if we ever parted, we'd tell each other face to face, she said. Then these papers arrived with no explanation, nothing. Several years later, when Post was asked about Kane and her children, he said that he had loved them, but had intentionally ended the relationship after his parole was denied. It was hard to cut it off, particularly because of the little girl, Post said. She, Priscilla Kane, was really special, but when I realized that I wasn't getting out, I knew I had to end it. She was such a loving person that she would have stuck with me and would still be here today if I hadn't driven her away. But what was the point? What kind of life could she have, and what kind of life would those kids have had waiting for me? I decided to drive her away. I had to do it. If not for her, then for my own sanity. It is much harder to do time if you are looking to the future, particularly if you know there isn't any future out there. I don't know how she feels about me, but the truth is that ending a relationship was probably the only decent thing I have done in my life. For 3 years, Kane grieved over Post. I felt so stupid, she said. I used to look in the mirror and say, you were a straight A student. You are intelligent. How did you let someone do this to you? During her 5-year relationship with Post, she had given him nearly $10,000, but it was the emotional toll on herself and her children that hurt the most, she said. My son and daughter idolized this man. He was their father. And then he just walked away. They couldn't understand how anyone could be so cold, and neither could I. Most women I met in prison were abused, mistreated, and misunderstood in the outside world, Kane explained. All they wanted was someone to love them. And then they fell into the trap where the man they loved used them. I thought we were different. I knew we were different. But after all these years, I honestly don't know if Bill really ever loved me or was simply using me to get a parole. Can you believe it, she asked. I love this man, married this man, planned to build my future with this man, and believed in this man. And today, I still don't know whether he loved me or was simply using me.